The Virtue of Playfulness by Boomer Trujillo, Chapter 1. Aristotle on Play as Medicine. Before Aristotle, Heraclitus the champion of play, and Plato the critic. As is typical, philosophers do not agree on much. Their opinions on play follow this trend. Even in ancient Greece, where philosophy had yet to mature, two camps already quibbled before Aristotle wrote a thing. One is best represented by Heraclitus. He wrote, "Life is a child playing, gaming. The ruling power is a child's." Like most of Heraclitus's writing, the quote is cryptic. We can only speculate about what he means since only fragments of his work survive, and we know little definitive about the games he would have known. But a good guess is that Heraclitus meant that play enraptures the player, and its pretenses are harmless, or at least agreed upon by the players at the outset of the game. There is a purity to children playing, children who experience happiness directly and have no need of asking for happiness's definition or its interactions with external affairs. Children playing represent the most important parts of life, flourishing and creating, and these capacities have no need of intellect, reputation, luxury, or even detailed explanation. In Heraclitus's philosophy, play is elevated from a meaningless trifle for children to life itself. It is the key to understanding the deep nature of reality. Plato represents the other camp. His view is most famously expressed in Republic. There, Plato proposes an educational model that uses music and art to educate people on proper morals. For him, music can directly move the soul, and narratives make us sympathize with the characters and their lives. Plato argues that educators in the Kallipolis, the beautiful city, should harness play's power to form good citizens. Play is a formidable pedagogical tool, and it can help make us into good people. However, not all art is edifying, and especially not the most popular works by poets such as Homer or tragedians such as Sophocles. As a direct result of its pedagogical power, Plato censors art. Both immoral art and the artists who make it are condemned and expelled from the Kallipolis. Plato worries that many artists misrepresent their subjects and that the inaccuracies in artworks corrupt audiences. For example, artists fail to even get the simple things right. If you've ever been on a theater or film set, you have seen how the rooms are made of facades and the props are not functional. For Plato, it is clear that the artists satisfy only appearances, not practical uses or higher ideals. But the audience thinks that the sets and props are real, and that the interactions between characters are believable, at least if the art is effective. The audience, therefore, falls in love with lies. Worse, according to Plato, artists depict the gods and heroes of Greek religion as vicious, thus not only misrepresenting mundane objects and affairs, but also the very ideals embedded in communities. The gods and heroes are supposed to be people we admire and model our lives after. They take center stage in productions and our moral imaginations, and this means that when artists portray them as monsters, the effects are worth alarm. For example, Zeus rapes many women in many ways. Leda as a swan, Danae as golden rain, Europa as a bull, and his own mother, Rhea, as a snake. Additionally, arguably one of the best people in Greek poetry, Priam, king of Troy, is beaten to death by his infant grandson, the infant being the son of Hector, Priam's good son, who was killed and defiled by Achilles. The depravity is inventive and inextricable from Greek theater and poetry. Moreover, these stories are not one-off tales. They are integral parts of the epics that gave Greeks their identities. And these gruesome tidbits are representative of entire genres such as tragedy. Many plays center on horror, such as the tragedies of Euripides. In Hecabe, for example, the titular queen of Troy is taken prisoner after the Greeks sack her city. She watches as her innocent daughter is sacrificed to sate the ghost of Achilles, and she finds her young son's body washed up on the shore, clearly having been murdered by the people who were supposed to shelter him. So, she takes her revenge. She convinces the man who murdered her son to come into a tent, and her handmaids murder his children in front of him. And then she gouges out his eyes. The last thing he sees in his sighted life is the murder of his children. Plato worries that such art might give us the wrong impression. It might whet, not quell, our appetites for lust, revenge, and impulse. And that spells doom for large groups of people who are even slightly influenced by such depraved art. After all, it is not okay to commit even the slightest bit of murder like Hecabe. Philosophers might want more nuance in the previous views, but that is unnecessary for the takeaway lesson here. Play, part of what we do in our leisure, is valued in radically different ways. On the one hand, the Heraclitean aspect assesses play positively. On the other hand, the Platonic views it with suspicion. And this forms the context for Aristotle's remarks. Aristotle tries to make sense of the conflicting accounts on play, and in this chapter, I argue that he tries to mediate the disagreements by relating play to many ethical concepts. By relating play to relaxation and childhood development, Aristotle defends the Heraclitean view that it is inextricable from human life and should be preserved. But by relating play to flourishing, pleasure, and leisure, Aristotle defends the Platonic view that play ought to be assessed with moral scrutiny. Aristotle, therefore, holds a deep ambivalence about play. He sees it as a pharmakon, the Greek word for drug that can be rendered equally as medicine or poison. And like any medicine, play begs careful study to get the dosage right. Before continuing, I must note two difficulties in addressing this topic. First, play is mixed in its evaluations by Aristotle, so I sometimes must address the positive to get to the negative, or the negative in the positive. However, I have attempted to minimize any back and forth to make your job easier as a reader. Second, even though I argue that Aristotle organizes the extant views on play in Greece and that they form a coherent position, I must admit that his remarks are scattered throughout his works and difficult to piece together. In my opinion, the biggest challenge is a linguistic problem. It is difficult to render accurately into English the Greek words related to play. Paidie is the most direct word for play, but it also gets translated as childish play, sport, game, pastime, and sometimes amusement. The verb for play, paizo, has similarly broad associations such as play, jest, and invent in a playful spirit. Adding complications, paidie and paizo share the root pais, which relates to the Greek word pais, child, or more loosely, paideia, education, but most literally concerns the upbringing of children. The Greek root pais, therefore, connects the concepts of play, playfulness, child, childishness, sport, game, amusement, and education, and translators face a difficult task of maintaining distinctions between concepts while showing their tight relationship. I try to pull insights from all relevant topics to assemble my interpretation of Aristotle's thoughts on play, and I bracket the Greek text where relevant. If you only take one thing away from this chapter, it should be that the most important idea in Aristotle's remarks on play is that he connects it to leisure. Leisure, for Aristotle, is the time we have away from work or any type of necessity. Skole, the Greek word for leisure, is the opposite of askolia, the word for work or business, literally non-leisure. Leisure time is essential for living a good life, and the justice of communities can be measured by how much leisure its citizens have, and what they do with that time. This connection between play and leisure will be crucial for the later chapters. The Heraclitean aspect in Aristotle's theory, play as medicine. One of the most unique things in Aristotle's remarks about play is that he calls it medicine, pharmakon. He argues that it can help tired and stressed people to relax, and anyone who has ever been alive, especially the past few years, or really at all, knows the importance of that. Aristotle goes as far as to say that relaxation and play are necessities in life. Aristotle explains, play is needed more amid serious occupations than at other times, for he who is hard at work has need of relaxation, and play gives relaxation, whereas occupation is always accompanied with exertion and effort. We should introduce amusements only at suitable times, and they should be our medicines, for the emotion which they create in the soul is relaxation, and from the pleasure we obtain rest. This excerpt argues that people who work hard or attend to serious matters are most in need of play because play offers relaxation, rest, and pleasure. Play is literally medicine that stops the ache of the day-to-day grind. And it is a medicine that can relax and rest the entire person, both body and mind. Play's main therapeutic effect is generated by the emotions of rest and relaxation and the sensation of pleasure. These effects happen both during and after play. It is important to emphasize that play is not merely for brutes to help them rest their bodies. Rather, there is an acute and potent psychological effect as well. Adult life is difficult on our bodies and minds, and play heals both. Aristotle observes that most flourishing people enjoy their pastimes and take refuge in them. Consider, for example, how friends who get together often play games, tell jokes, or reminisce about good times. They not only talk about the harrowing struggles and heroic victories, they also prize the small, light moments. I played football in Texas when I was in high school, and some of my favorite memories are not about the games we won, and they certainly are not about the sweltering August practices. They are about the jokes and pranks in the locker room after practice or games, when we were too exhausted to do much else. And today, these are the stories that I tell most when talking about those days with my former teammates or others. Aristotle knew that there was something to the downtime, the in-between time, the moments that many philosophers are tempted to overlook. But looking back, we often find that those small moments of respite meant more than we thought that they did at the time. The rest, relaxation, and amusement that we take in other people is so important that Aristotle dedicates an entire virtue to it, wit, eutrapelia. The social play of amusing ourselves and friends and simply enjoying each other's company is ubiquitous and necessary for a good life. However, Aristotle argues that social amusements can be done in better or worse ways. Buffoons, for example, take every opportunity to make jokes and be vulgar. Stiffs stray in the opposite direction, neither making nor taking jokes, nor relishing the pleasures of social amusements. But the witty few, they have a proper appreciation for social pleasures, and they develop a sense of wit that establishes them or that enables them to cultivate pleasant interactions with others in their downtime. Consider the conversation of coworkers resting before they get back to work. Aristotle thinks it important to analyze the ethical dimensions of our downtime and the ways we play during it. Part of what makes this conversation complicated, however, is that Aristotle breaks human life into many developmental stages. His remarks on wit and relaxation show it important for adults, but he also has much to say about children. Aristotle emphasizes play's importance in childhood development. He implores parents, caretakers, and politicians to preserve play in the lives of children. He argues that children under the age of 5 need to avoid both labor and study and that they instead should fill their time with play. He also warns that people should never stop children who cry and scream because both behaviors are crucial to their proper development. In these remarks, he not only describes play's role in childhood development, like a psychologist would, but he also argues for ethical and political protections of that play. In fact, his major political treatise, Politics, ends with an educational program for children and adolescents that includes play. He is direct in his rationale. No one will doubt, he says, that the legislator should direct his attention above all to the education of youth, for the neglect of education does harm to the Constitution. In other words, Aristotle argues that the only way to maintain a just, healthy, or strong state is to ensure that the youth are educated well. Aristotle breaks with certain Greek traditions, so he has to make a case for his general system. For example, rather than continue in the Greek tradition of private tutors or family-based education, Aristotle argued that education in the most important subject should be accessible to everyone. Just states require as many educated people as possible. You protect a state by educating good citizens. To do this, Aristotle proposes a quadrivium, 4 subjects that education in just societies must cover. Gramma, reading and writing, gymnasion, physical training, graphe, drawing, and musicae, music and poetry. What interests me about this quadrivium is that it not only includes practical things such as reading, writing, and drawing, here meant in the sense of diagramming or drafting. Such things are useful for communication and connecting and conducting business. Literate, articulate people do business well. Aristotle guessed no one would disagree with gramma and graphe for that reason. These disciplines make the state money. Gymnasion is not as practical, however, and he knew that he had to defend this idea. After all, wrestling, running, and playing games might be seen as superfluous by some. Aristotle did not think to mention the positive effects of gymnasion on health of the body, but he did mention how it cultivates courage, andreia. This is coded language in the Greco-Roman world. Andreia means courage, but it can also be translated as manliness. Andreia shares the root of aner, which means man, specifically gendered masculine. Similarly, the Latin virtus means courage and vir means man. I think he knew that opponents of his educational system would retract their criticisms of gymnasium if they heard manliness was at stake. So the games and sports that would naturally happen in gymnasium gained their public support from macho Greeks in a rhetorical appeal to masculinity. That leaves the last of the quadrivium, musicae, to justify, and this one is the trickiest. Musicae in many languages looks like the word related to music, and it is in Greek too. But in Greek, it also relates to musai, the muses. Musicae literally involves the art forms of that the muses preside over. And in ancient Greece, that was most directly experienced in narrative poetry set to music, especially as read in public and performed on stages at rituals and festivals. Think of Hesiod, Homer, Aristophanes, Sophocles, etc. So Aristotle is arguing for a public education as opposed to private that includes reading, writing, and drawing, fine, that's good for business, and sport, okay, that makes people manly, and music. A critic might ask incredulously, so now you want to set up an educational system to turn all the children into musical theater majors? I must admit that I'm imagining an alarmist opponent to Aristotle because no such one exists in the text. But Athens exiled Aristotle at the end of his life, so I do not think that I am far off. And the fact that later historians preserved Aristotle's image as thin-calved, beady-eyed, and luxuriously clothed, it is easy to imagine hypermasculine Greeks reacting to his words in this way. In any event, imagine your own child telling you that he wants to study wrestling and poetry, especially compared to your other child telling you that she wants to study math or drafting. Aristotle knew that he had to say something to defend this part of the quadrivium. First, he defends leisure, scholae, the free time that we have away from direct necessities and that we can use to pursue such things as sport and music. He says, nature herself, as has been often said, requires that we should be able not only to work well, but to use leisure well. For, as I must repeat once again, the first principle of all action is leisure. In other words, we work hard and do difficult things so that we can protect and enjoy our leisure time. And if we lacked leisure time, our lives would lack something important. But why should Aristotle argue so strongly for the importance of leisure? He offers a few reasons. First, for him, leisure itself is necessary for enjoying life and cultivating happiness, and those without leisure have trouble doing either. Aristotle writes, "To be always seeking after the useful does not become free and exalted souls." Human life is about more than mere utility or connecting every action to a direct purpose. The best kinds of people do more than work. They take time to enjoy life and cultivate aspects of their personality unrelated to survival. And the best kinds of people value their companions beyond their professional or social usefulness. They make time to enjoy each other's company or improve their lives together. Not only does spending your leisure well cultivate mental and social health, but it also creates cooperative and engaged citizens. This is why Aristotle turns his attention to leisure in politics. Second, one of the boldest defenses of leisure is through a rebuke of Athens' biggest political rival, Sparta. He diagnoses Sparta's failure as a state as not being able to live in times of peace and leisure. Yes, Sparta could wage war, but in times of peace, their iron lost its edge. They fell apart. Aristotle is vehemently anti-imperialist. For him, it is unsustainable. It makes no sense to go to war or fight for resources without strong reasons. War for war's sake is ridiculous to him. So reflecting on why we go to war and why we work hard, Aristotle repeats something that becomes a motto. People should only go to war for the sake of peace, and they should only work for the sake of leisure, repeated 3 times. In other words, what good is war if there is no peace to enjoy afterward, and what good is labor if there is no enjoying the leisure that follows? But there is a catch. The only way to learn to enjoy peace and leisure is through education. Aristotle advocates for a liberal arts education because he wants people to be free. Liberal here literally means free. The reason Aristotle thinks that everyone should be educated in reading, writing, drawing, physical education, and art is that it teaches you to use your free time well. In those circumstances where you do not need to do anything, you reveal what you most value. And the Spartans could only start another war because that is all they knew. Aristotle pulls no punches here. He says, "And for this the legislator is to blame, he never having taught them how to lead the life of leisure." Forever wars only work in science fiction cultures, as in Star Trek's Klingons or Warhammer 40,000's many factions. In real life, forever wars kill people, cultures, and the freest parts of ourselves. But art and play preserve and promote life, humanity, and freedom. This is why everyone in a just community would be educated not only in practical things, but also in beautiful things, things that serve no further purpose than the thing or experience itself. People must be taught to handle their freedom. Otherwise, they start more wars like Sparta, or they engage in more consumption that eventually starts more wars. Peace and leisure are vital to justice. Aristotle argues that peace and leisure ought to be the goals of all military measures, and that the goodness of citizens, rulers, and states can be partially measured by how much leisure time they have and what they do with that time. Good states allow as many of their people to flourish as possible, and their rulers and citizens need leisure to cultivate intellectual capacities to help them organize and rule society more justly. Leisure is at the root of justice, philosophy, and happiness. In Aristotle, we see a historic shift for Greece. Leisure did not always exist in human history, nor was it always valued. In archaic Greece, roughly 3 centuries before Socrates, Greeks saw work itself as sacred. You can see this reflected in the works of Hesiod. He called his archaic contemporaries a, quote, race of iron, who will never cease from toil and misery by day or night. And he proclaimed, "It is from work that men are rich in flocks and wealthy, and a working man is much dearer to the immortals. Work is no reproach, but not working is a reproach." However, things changed. By classical Greece, the period of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, people generally began to value leisure not only in philosophy, but in popular plays and poems. Classical Greeks started contrasting leisure, scholae, with labors, ponoi, mobs, riches, and even the busyness of political rivalries. Moreover, Greeks started to associate leisure with rest and happiness. Aristotle's arguments make it explicit. The goal of an individual person's life and of a state is the same: leisure and peace. Or in his own words, "It is particularly disgraceful not to be able to use them, the goods of life, in times of leisure, to show excellent qualities in action and war, and when they have peace and leisure, to be no better than slaves." If you want to be a free person, you have to be able to use your leisure time well. The challenge of combining these comments is to figure out why play seems to pop up in the lives of happy people so often. And for that, I think the key is that Aristotle usually relates play to leisure, which becomes a pillar concept for his philosophy. For Aristotle, leisure, scholae, is necessary for a full, flourishing human life. Without leisure, people cannot develop capacities for reflection, creativity, or political involvement. And without these capacities and activities, people cannot be considered truly happy. Aristotle repeats throughout Politics that while humans must work to secure goods necessary for living, for example, food, shelter, and social coordination, leisure is better than toil, and leisure is the goal of labor. He argues this most poignantly when claiming that leisure is the first principle of all action, as we saw above. It matters for play that leisure is important for life. Simply put, we need leisure to live well, and play is a pleasurable part of that leisure. This then implies that part of our leisure, the very goal and product of our professional labor and political organization, should be spent in play. The best human lives include leisure, and play is part of that. The best human lives include pleasure, and play generates that. Therefore, for Aristotle, play will be found in every flourishing human life, in the amusement of children, the relaxation of adults, the pontificating of philosophers, and the social cohesion of communities. You are probably getting the sense of the difficulty here. Aristotle thinks that adults should use their downtime to amuse themselves and rest, but not so much that they become buffoons. And he thinks children should be allowed to run and scream and play, but only until they're 5 years old. Readers of Aristotle will get the sense that play is important, but they will be left with the question, how important? And here I can offer two interpretive options. First, we could hold a weak coinstantiation view about play and happiness. This view says that play and happiness are merely coinstantiated, or things that appear together for whatever reason. This weak interpretation would make no further commitments with respect to how or why. It would only mark that happy people tend also to be people who play at some time. Young people play, adults play, and happy people having lived through childhood and adulthood obviously play too. But who knows why? Contrastingly, a second and stronger option would be a causal view. Other interpreters of Aristotle might say that he's making a causal claim about the relationship between play and happiness, where one affects the other, such as happiness producing play or vice versa. Here, the idea is that there is a deeper connection between play on the one hand and happiness on the other. And this connection goes beyond mere coincidental coinstantiation. There is a causal explanation for why they appear together. Aristotle himself does little to argue for how strict the relationship between play and happiness is. The only things that are clear in this metaphysical sense are that A, play and happiness are not identical and are distinct things, and B, play is often, maybe always, included in the lives of happy people. At minimum, Aristotle's remarks on play in the Nicomachean Ethics and Politics show that play is a natural part of life. For children, it facilitates development. For adults, it aids in rest and is cherished when reflecting on life with others. At whatever stage in human life, people should value play, and Aristotle affords it an important place in life that should not be eliminated altogether. Ridding people of play would detrimentally affect childhood development and adults' abilities to rest and relax. Heraclitus died over a century before Aristotle was born. But had Heraclitus and Aristotle lived at the same time, they could have agreed that play is crucial for life. The Platonic aspect in Aristotle's theory, play as poison. Despite the positive qualities that Aristotle ascribed to play, and despite his defense of musicae as essential for education, he also had significant reservations. It is easiest to let him speak for himself. Indeed, there is nothing which the legislator should be more careful to drive away than indecency of speech, for the light utterance of shameful words leads soon to shameful actions. The young especially should never be allowed to repeat or hear anything of the sort. A freeman who is found saying or doing what is forbidden, if he be too young, as yet to have the privilege of reclining at the public tables, should be disgraced and beaten. And since we do not allow improper language, clearly, we should also banish pictures or speeches from the stage which are indecent. The legislator should not allow youth to be spectators of iambi or comedy until they are of an age to sit at the public tables and to drink strong wine. By that time, education will have armed them against the evil influences of such representations. Here, Aristotle sounds a lot like Plato banning the poets from the Callipolis. He explicitly worries that careless talk about shameful things makes those shameful things easier to do. Aristotle claims that stories prepare youth for life and set expectations, so immoral art trains them incorrectly. It is important to remember that Greek comedy is different from the reverent attitude many Americans have toward ancient Greece. People might read, if anyone, Plato and Aristotle, or maybe Homer and Sophocles. But most do not read Aristophanes or about Dionysus. This means that we forget that Aristophanes repeatedly makes fart jokes in clouds, or that the plot of his Lysistrata is about women, is that women are trying to end the Peloponnesian War by withholding sex from their husbands. Also, cults of Dionysus were strong in Greece. Artwork depicted him and related characters like Priapus with huge red erections, and there were often parades where worshippers adorned and carried around penises. This helps make sense of Aristotle's remarks about obscenity. Aristotle observes that we favor what we first come to know. So, we should keep kids away from badness, vice, and hate so that they avoid bias in favor of these qualities. The positive sensations associated with play should not be associated with unsavory things. There is truth behind every joke, and immoral jokes are no exception. For example, consider how Bill Cosby joked about drugging women before it came out that he actually was, or how Louis C.K. frequently joked about masturbating before he harassed women in that way. However, Aristotle does not think people powerless to irreverent art, unlike his teacher Plato. He expresses confidence in education, or youth that have been taught well to withstand the temptations of vice. Rather than banning things outright like Plato, Aristotle censors them for children below the drinking age because by then their education will have done its job. This introduces a critical complication to Aristotle's thoughts on play. Play is not all good, as Heraclitus implies, even if Aristotle protects it for children and adults and builds it into education. Rather, play also has a darker side. Aristotle shows the influence that his teacher Plato had on him by placing many constraints on play, especially for children. As covered in the previous section, Aristotle observes that play produces pleasure, but he has two interesting explanations for why. First, it lacks compulsion. Hence, ease, freedom from toil, relaxation, play, rest, and sleep belong to the class of pleasant things, for these are all free from any element of compulsion. Because play lacks forcible demands, it feels pleasant to the player. Because you do not need to play, play feels good. Before moving on to his second reason for play's pleasantness, I need to note a host of complications in this lack of necessity aspect. Aristotle's remarks on play and its lack of necessity raise questions about what necessity means and whether introducing necessity debases the status of the activity as play, its pleasure, or both. He only says that the lack of necessity is what makes play pleasant. At least two interpretations are possible here. First, Aristotle could be making a metaphysical claim about the activity where play loses its status as play or its pleasant quality if biological, economic, social, or political necessity directly bears on it. Second, he could be making an experiential claim about the mindset of the player, that a player cannot feel outside compulsion to play for it to be pleasant or to be considered play, even if such necessities exist. The obvious case here would be professional athletes or gamers. If the metaphysical reading is right, then Aristotle would say that they are not playing because their biological, economic, and social livelihoods depend on the playing. Or this somehow changes the nature of the pleasure, maybe downgrading it. But if the experiential reading is right, professionals could properly play or feel full pleasure as long as they do not feel the necessities while playing. But I think another example is probably more relatable, and that is how we evaluate rehearsal or practice for playing, the activities that you have to do to get better at the play. Both seem necessary for certain types of play, but it is not clear whether they are play themselves or whether they feel good. For example, it is easy to understand how playing Enter Sandman on guitar is play or pleasant. But could you deem practicing pentatonic scales in E minor to get better at the solos in Enter Sandman as play or pleasant? In this example, we have a different kind of necessity, the necessity to improve one's skills as a precondition of playing something at a certain level of competence. This is not biological, economic, or political, but part of the progress of the activity itself. Unfortunately, I have no room to address these problems here, but other philosophers have written about these issues. The second reason that Aristotle thinks play is pleasant is that play, games, and contests, both combative and intellectual, present an opportunity for victory. Aristotle argues, victory is also pleasant and not merely for the competitive, but to everyone. The winner sees himself in the light of a champion, and everyone has a more or less keen appetite for being that. Play and sports are pleasurable because they present an opportunity to win, and everyone likes being a winner, or at least entertaining the thought. So, play's potential for victory also makes it a pleasurable experience. It is important to add that play can also involve things that do not have victors or goals. Aristotle includes silliness, gelos, in the class of pleasant things too, which can be exemplified in people, words, or actions. Play can be associated with structured games and contests, but it also can take a more generalized form like joking. These explanations of play's mechanisms show that Aristotle thought play's pleasure important to explain. However, play's connection to pleasure is not all good. Aristotle is suspicious of pleasure and, by extension, whatever produces it. He goes so far as to say that pleasure is the one thing that we should guard ourselves most against. After all, it is hard to find any person who is deficient in experiencing pleasures, but it is easy to find those who over-delight in amusement, even at the expense of their health and finances. Additionally, not all pleasures are equal for Aristotle. For Aristotle, pleasure is not a mere raw sensation. Pleasure is what we experience when our capacities are used to their highest degrees of completion and fulfillment, when our capacities do what they were meant to do. This is why Aristotle argues that the best forms of pleasure perfect our best capacities, that is, our intellectual ones. Aristotle saw the pleasure of studying philosophy, using the characteristically human capacity of reason to understand profound truths, as importantly different from the pleasure of a good meal, using our animalistic appetites and gustatory faculties to savor dead flesh and plants. Both are pleasurable and important, but the intellectual ones are better than the somatic ones. He is so certain of this that he says that no adult would choose to live with a child's mental faculties, even if it promised perfect satisfaction of those juvenile capacities. Additionally, pleasures differ in quality based on their objects. Pleasures attached to good objects and activities are praiseworthy, but pleasures attached to bad ones are blameworthy. To illustrate this, he says that no person would do something incredibly pleasant if it involved engaging in utterly shameful activities, even if no pain resulted. Guilty pleasures are heavy on the guilt because they are attached to bad objects. No matter how much I may enjoy ghost hunting reality television, I cannot in good conscience compare its pleasures to the pleasures of fine cinema, such as films featuring John William Farrell, or at least on Aristotelian grounds. One engages adult, cultivated human capacities, the other does not. These remarks should prove that pleasure is a complicated thing for Aristotle. It is so complicated that he dedicates one of the core virtues of his system to pleasure, temperance, sophrosune, aka moderation. We also saw above that Aristotle established the virtue of wit to regulate social pleasures. For Aristotle, temperate people virtuously regulate the pleasures that they experience as individuals, especially physical ones, for example, eating, drinking, or having sex. Humans are animals that can experience pleasure, and we need pleasures to fulfill our lives. But pleasures also present ethical challenges. People who enjoy too many pleasures are self-indulgent, and the pleasures that self-indulgent people pursue control many aspects of their lives, which wrecks them. Consider gluttons or gamblers. Also bad, but in a different way, those who shun pleasure are ascetic bores. They live a life deprived of the fundamental human experiences of feeling good. Neither the ascetic nor the self-indulgent can flourish. Only temperate people stand a chance. This is because the temperate experience the right pleasures in the right ways. Play and its associated pleasures will change their ethical value depending on who does them in which situations for whatever reasons or feelings. Play should not serve self-indulgence, buffoonery, or flattery. And the ascetic, boorish, and surly will neglect play to their own detriment. Consider a poker game between coworkers after a long shift. Someone addicted to gambling or someone who belittles people at the table plays viciously, whereas someone who plays to enjoy the game and to form deeper friendships with colleagues plays virtuously. Play can help people live well, provided that they understand pleasure's role in life, feel good about appropriate pleasures, and find proper occasions for it. For example, a surgeon who plays crosswords during downtime between consultations with patients is more virtuous than a surgeon who plays by burning his initials into his patient's organs with the cauterizer. The action of play is not morally neutral. Play can serve both good and bad ends, taking us closer to or further from happiness. The happy person is neither a pleasureless ascetic bore nor an overindulgent wanton debauchee. Temperate people appreciate pleasant experiences, and witty people appreciate pleasant social interactions. Humans have a capacity for pleasure that should be cultivated, and play is nested within such conversations about the goods and ills of pleasure. Aristotle was so ambivalent about play that he outright prohibits some behaviors. For example, he argued that play should not be base or servile, laborious or painful, or undisciplined or loose. Such play forms bad habits that can influence later life. Building on this, recall the quote that opened this section where Aristotle harshly prohibited indecent speech and pictures. Casually saying and seeing shameful things leads to shameful action. So children, especially, should be forbidden from such vulgarities. But his argument is more than a developmental caution for adolescents. Aristotle extends the argument to adults too. According to Aristotle, even freemen or elders who transgress propriety deserve beatings, shame, and degradation. To emphasize, beatings and degradation. Strong words from the philosopher who defended play and musique. Play done viciously merits scorn and punishment. Play has ethical weight. It affects habits, and it is done with people you need respect and help from. Consider the ways department dynamics change when a holiday party and its games inadvertently showcase the addiction of the departmental lush, the duplicity of the departmental sycophant, or the sadism of the departmental leader. Play's connections to individual and social development mean that it must be appropriate, or we risk marring our characters and our social standings. Aristotle's starkest restriction on play is when he argues that play can never be sufficient for flourishing, as important as it may be otherwise. Play can never be enough to make you happy. One argument for this point begins with an observation. Witty people are deeply valued by tyrants, who like to keep them in their company and dedicate ample time to pursuing their amusements. Yet, the playful despot's life is not complete if he does not develop himself well or pursue the right goods, no matter how much he plays or how often he has playful people around him. Aristotle warns that people who are afforded ample leisure and many goods are in special need of justice, temperance, and philosophy to avoid insolence. These remarks indicate that the context of play in a person's moral life matters. Even if it can help us to relax and feel good, play cannot make us good enough to actualize all of our psychological, ethical, and civic capacities, nor can it alone help us to manage the competing goods of life. Aristotle also argues that there are people who play and experience amusement, but whom no one would consider happy. For example, slaves can enjoy amusements, but it cannot be said that slaves are happy. For Aristotle, they are a counterexample to the claim that, as long as people can play, they can be happy. So while we do not need to be royalty to be happy, we also cannot be slaves and be happy, no matter how much we play. Certain political arrangements destroy our flourishing, no matter subjective joy. The implication seems to be that, when it comes down to it, play is mostly subjective joy. It is crucial to consider why we do what we do. For Aristotle, human actions need a goal or a purpose. Aristotle found absurd the people who intentionally suffer merely for the sake of amusement. Play and amusement do not seem like worthy goals of our self-discipline, personal development, and sustained labor in the face of challenges that come from our commitments to our values. He denounces play as the goal of action or the purpose of work, calling such a view childish and foolish. He argues with Anacharsis, who says that people play so that they can work later, not the other way around. We can play hard to work hard, but we should not work hard to play hard. These remarks imply that play is not an intrinsically good thing. Rather, play serves the end of more serious efforts because it allows someone to rest to return to work later. Part of the reason he thinks this is play's connection to leisure. We play when no necessities bear on us. So, he argued that if play were the primary thing that we should do with our leisure, then play would be the goal of life and all our efforts. We work hard to secure peace for what? Play? This is ludicrous to Aristotle, so he argues that we should not spend all of our leisure at play because it is not the goal of life. We spend all of our time and effort to gain leisure, and to Aristotle it would be a wasted opportunity to spend that leisure time only at play. There are more important things to develop, such as intellectual, ethical, and civic capacities that help us to live well or reform our communities. We can use free time to make ourselves more virtuous, social, and just, not merely to play. This section's remarks should prove that, even if Aristotle disagreed with his teacher Plato about many things, he certainly shared a deep influence. Like Plato, Aristotle set severe limits on play, art, and leisure time activities. Setting the dosage of play. Aristotle thought it important to address play in Nicomachean Ethics, Politics, Rhetoric, and other works. He discussed it in relation to flourishing, pleasure, and justice. Such wide-ranging and varied discussions make for a complicated view. The upshot of Aristotle's passages is that play is important for life, but it also has the potential to habituate children and adults in ways that will detract from their moral characters and accomplishments. Play affects individuals and their psychological development, and it can also change social dynamics. Play matters, but it matters equally how, why, and when people play. We need to play, but this need creates responsibility to play well. And even though a just state should protect play for children and ensure an education with physical games and art, and even though a just state should arrange as much leisure as possible for all citizens, that same state should keep children away from bad influences, and its community members should beat the most shameful players. On the one hand, we can see the Heraclitean element. Aristotle argued that play is an ineliminable part of life because it helps children to develop and it helps adults to relax. It provides therapy to the fatigued, and since play is pleasurable and since life needs pleasures, play can be part of a virtuous, happy life. Aristotle explicitly dismisses ascetic and boorish lifestyles that shun pleasure, and he criticizes any life that only works and never experiences leisure. He also denounces any community that demands its citizens always be utilitarian and never experience leisure. This is why he defends musike as necessary for education. Aristotle judged pleasure and leisure crucial for both individual flourishing and social justice. Play can be a part of a flourishing person's leisure time, and it can be part of the appropriate pleasures that people need to live well in larger communities. On the other hand, we can see the Platonic element in Aristotle's comments on play too. Aristotle warned against pleasures in play. Certain forms of play are expressly forbidden. If the play is base, laborious, or loose, it can habituate a person poorly and lead to unhappiness. Play is never outside the scope of moral considerations for cultivating the best possible self to lead a characteristically good human life. People can play, but only if they also develop the necessary intellectual, ethical, and civic capacities to become full, flourishing humans who help to organize a just society. While play cannot be eliminated from life because it helps people to develop and relax, it also cannot be the overall goal of life. Play is not the deepest source of happiness. Rather, play serves more serious occupations like resting one to return to work. We play to gain respite, but we use our renewed minds to attend to the deeper matters, like cultivating virtuous selves and organizing just communities. Aristotle's remarks on play are written as though they are simultaneously addressing multiple groups of critics. He wants to defend the importance of play from Spartan communities that may try to eliminate play, leisure, and silliness as superfluous. His defense of play is an accusation against such groups and lifestyles. But he also places limits on play, arguing against critics that may turn the whole of life into a game or a pursuit of the longest and most durable somatic pleasures as the end goal of life. His limitation of play's importance lambasts the wanton, libertine, and luxurious. Play serves the mind, the cultivation of character, and the actualization of the best human lives and communities. Play is not the end of life itself. Like human life and ethical values, play is complicated for Aristotle. Play is necessary and can help us to overcome temptations to work too hard or to neglect leisure altogether. But play also needs to be evaluated as an action that can deteriorate moral life. It seems appropriate, then, that Aristotle calls play a pharmakon, a drug, translatable as both medicine and poison. His remarks display a philosopher trying to get the dosage of the medicine of play right.